What if I told you that the Vatican, one of the most powerful moral and diplomatic forces on the planet, just said no to President Trump? Not over abortion, not over immigration, not over religious freedom, over Gaza, over a peace initiative that 17 countries have already signed on to, over a plan that has pledged more than $5 billion in reconstruction aid. The Holy See just walked away from the table. And the reason why might shock you. Stay with me, because what just happened is way bigger than most people realize. Before we dive in, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Every single day on Senate Decoded, we break down the stories the mainstream media either ignores or gets wrong. You deserve the full picture. Subscribe now so you never miss a briefing. All right, let's get into it. Welcome back to Senate Decoded, the channel where we go deeper than the headlines, cut through the noise, and give you the complete story on what's really happening in Washington and around the world. Today we are covering a story that has massive geopolitical implications: the Vatican's decision to decline participation in President Trump's newly formed Board of Peace. This is the board tasked with managing recovery efforts in Gaza after the Israel-Hamas war. Nearly 20 countries have signed on. Over $5 billion in aid has been pledged. Leaders from across the globe, and from Latin America to Europe to the Middle East, have joined. But the Vatican, they said no, and the reason the Holy See gave for declining is absolutely fascinating. And it tells you everything you need to know about the tension between Trump's vision of how global crisis management should work and the old guard establishment view that the United Nations should be running the show. So what exactly is the Board of Peace? Why did the Vatican decline? What does this say about the future of Gaza reconstruction? And what does it reveal about the broader struggle between nationalism and globalism in managing international crises? We're going to decode all of this today. Let's get into it. First, let's establish what exactly we're talking about, because the Board of Peace is one of those stories that's been underreported relative to its actual significance. In January 2026, President Donald Trump chartered a new international body called the Board of Peace. The stated mission of this board is to manage recovery efforts in the Gaza Strip, following the devastating Israel-Hamas war that left much of Gaza in ruins. The board is tasked with coordinating reconstruction, humanitarian aid, governance support, and long-term stability efforts. The charter signing ceremony took place in Davos, Switzerland, the same venue where global elites gather every year for the World Economic Forum. 17 countries participated in that initial ceremony, sending presidents, prime ministers, and other senior government officials to sign on. The countries that joined represent a geographically and ideologically diverse coalition: nations from Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. President Trump announced just this past Sunday that board members have pledged more than $5 billion in aid for Gaza. That's not a trivial sum. That is a massive international commitment to rebuild one of the most devastated regions on Earth. Israel formally joined the board last week, right before Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's meeting with Trump at the White House. That is significant because it signals Israeli buy-in to a reconstruction process that will inevitably shape the future governance and security arrangements in Gaza. The White House also extended invitations to several other major players, including Russia, Belarus, France, Germany, Vietnam, Finland, Ukraine, Ireland, Greece, and China. Some of those countries have accepted, others have declined or are still deliberating. Poland and Italy both announced this week that they would not be joining, and now the Vatican has made the same decision. So what exactly did the Vatican say, and why does it matter? On Tuesday, Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the second most powerful official in the Holy See after the Pope himself, announced that the Vatican would not participate in the Board of Peace. His reasoning was carefully worded but very clear. He said the Holy See will not participate in the Board of Peace because of its particular nature, which is evidently not that of other states. Now, what does that mean? The Vatican is not a state in the traditional sense. It's the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, the spiritual home of over 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide, and it has a unique status in international law as a sovereign entity. The Holy See holds observer status at the United Nations, maintains diplomatic relations with countries around the world, and engages in international diplomacy. But it does so as a moral and spiritual authority, not as a traditional nation-state with armies, economies, and geopolitical interests. So, Parolin's first point is essentially this: the Vatican is different. It cannot participate in initiatives designed for nation-states without carefully considering whether that participation is appropriate given the Holy See's unique mission. But then Parolin went further. He said there are points that leave us somewhat perplexed and some critical points that would need to find explanations. And here's where it gets really interesting. Parolin identified one of those critical points explicitly. One concern is that at the international level, it should above all be the UN that manages these crisis situations. This is one of the points on which we have insisted. Let me decode that diplomatic language for you. The Vatican is saying, we believe the United Nations, not an ad hoc coalition organized by the United States, should be the primary body managing post-conflict recovery in places like Gaza. This is not a minor difference of opinion. This is a fundamental clash of visions about how the international system should work. Let's talk about the tension that the Vatican just put its finger on, because it's at the heart of so many geopolitical debates right now in Congress and beyond. On one side, you have the traditional post-World War II vision of international order. In this vision, the United Nations is the central institution for managing global crises. The UN Security Council is supposed to authorize military action. UN agencies are supposed to coordinate humanitarian relief. UN peacekeepers are supposed to stabilize conflict zones. The whole architecture of international law and multilateral cooperation is built around the idea that the UN is the primary venue for collective action. The Vatican has been one of the strongest supporters of this vision for decades. The Holy See believes in multilateralism, in international cooperation, in the rule of law as embodied by institutions like the UN. This is deeply rooted in Catholic social teaching, which emphasizes solidarity, the common good, and the dignity of all people. From the Vatican's perspective, letting the UN manage crises is not just a practical question, it's a moral one. On the other side, you have the nationalist, sovereigntist critique of the UN system, a view that's gained tremendous traction in the Senate and among many congressional Republicans. In this view, the UN is slow, bureaucratic, ineffective, and often paralyzed by great power politics. The Security Council is gridlocked whenever the interests of the permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, diverge. UN agencies are bloated and wasteful. UN peacekeeping missions have a mixed record at best, and in some cases, the UN actively undermines the interests of democracies and free societies by giving platforms and legitimacy to authoritarian regimes. President Trump has been one of the most vocal critics of the UN system. During his first term, he repeatedly criticized the UN for being unfair to Israel, for wasting American taxpayer money, and for failing to deliver results. His administration pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council, which Trump argued was dominated by human rights abusers. He slashed funding to UN agencies, including UNRWA, the UN agency that provides services to Palestinian refugees, and has been accused of being infiltrated by Hamas. The Board of Peace represents Trump's alternative vision. Instead of waiting for the UN to act in order to be blocked from acting by Russian or Chinese vetoes at the Security Council, the United States assembles a coalition of willing partners who share a commitment to actually getting things done. This is a more flexible, more action-oriented approach. It bypasses the gridlock and bureaucracy of the UN system. But from the Vatican's perspective, this approach is problematic. It sidelines the institution that the Holy See believes should be at the center of international crisis management. It creates a parallel structure that could undermine the legitimacy and authority of the UN. And it raises the risk of fragmentation. If every major power starts creating its own ad hoc coalitions for managing crises, what happens to the idea of a rules-based international order? Let's bring this back to the immediate practical question. What does the Vatican's decision mean for Gaza? In the short term, probably not that much. The Vatican was never going to be a major financial contributor to Gaza reconstruction. The Holy See doesn't have the kind of economic resources that countries like the United States, the Gulf Arab states, or European nations can bring to bear. The Vatican's contribution would have been moral and diplomatic, lending the weight of the Catholic Church's global authority to the reconstruction effort. But in the longer term, the Vatican's absence from the Board of Peace is symbolically significant. It signals that not everyone is on board with Trump's approach. It gives cover to other countries, particularly in Europe, that may be skeptical of the Board of Peace but don't want to be the first to say no. We've already seen Poland and Italy decline to join. The Vatican's decision reinforces that there is a legitimate alternative view about how Gaza reconstruction should be managed. It also raises questions about who is actually going to be running things on the ground in Gaza. The Board of Peace can pledge billions of dollars in aid, but aid doesn't rebuild infrastructure or establish governance by itself. You need implementing organizations, you need logistics, you need security, and you need some level of international legitimacy and acceptance from the local population. The UN already has agencies operating in Gaza, UNRWA, the UN Development Program, the World Food Program, and others. If the Board of Peace operates entirely outside the UN framework, there is a risk of duplication, inefficiency, and turf battles. On the other hand, if the Board of Peace tries to work through existing UN agencies, it runs into the same problems that Trump was trying to avoid in the first place: bureaucracy, political paralysis, and potential corruption or infiltration by hostile actors like Hamas. This is not an easy problem to solve, and the Vatican's decision to sit this one out highlights just how contentious and complicated the path forward in Gaza really is. Zoom out for a moment and consider what this story tells us about the broader state of international politics in 2026 and what it means for debates happening right now in the Senate. We are living through a period of intense competition between different models of global governance. The old multilateral order, built around institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, is under enormous strain. Rising powers like China are building their own parallel institutions. Regional powers are asserting themselves more aggressively. And nationalist leaders in democracies are increasingly skeptical of international organizations that they see as unaccountable, ineffective, or hostile to their interests. Trump's Board of Peace is part of this broader trend toward what you might call minilateralism, assembling smaller, more flexible coalitions of countries that actually want to work together, rather than trying to force consensus among 193 UN member states with wildly divergent interests and values. This approach has real advantages. It can be faster, more focused, more results-oriented. It allows democracies to work together without being held hostage by authoritarian regimes that use international institutions to obstruct and delay. Many senators, particularly Republicans, have embraced this vision as a more practical alternative to the UN's dysfunction. But it also has real risks. If every major power starts creating its own coalitions and ignoring the UN whenever it's convenient, you lose the shared norms and rules that have prevented great power conflict for the past 80 years. You get a more fragmented, more unstable international system where might makes right and smaller countries get caught in the crossfire. The Vatican's position reflects a deep worry about that outcome. The Holy See has always been a voice for the weak, the vulnerable, and the marginalized in international affairs. From the Vatican's perspective, the UN, for all its flaws, is the one institution where small countries have a voice and where moral arguments can be made on a global stage. Undermining the UN risks creating a world where only the powerful matter. Whether you agree with that view or not, it's important to understand it, because it's a view shared by a lot of countries, a lot of civil society organizations, and a lot of people around the world who fear that the alternative to the UN is not a better system, but no system at all. Let's talk for a moment about the Vatican's unique position in all of this, because it's genuinely fascinating from a diplomatic perspective. The Holy See is not like other countries. It doesn't have an army. Well, technically it has the Swiss Guard, but they're a ceremonial force protecting the Pope, not a military that projects power. It doesn't have a large economy. It doesn't have natural resources. It doesn't have a significant population. What the Vatican has is moral authority. It speaks for over 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. It has diplomatic relations with the vast majority of countries on Earth. It has a 2,000-year history of engaging with questions of war, peace, justice, and human dignity. And it has a global network of churches, schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations that give it unparalleled access and credibility in communities around the world. When the Pope speaks, people listen. Not because he has tanks or bombs, but because he represents something larger than politics. And that gives the Holy See a unique ability to influence international affairs through persuasion, mediation, and moral witness. Pope Leo, the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church, received a personal invitation from President Trump to join the Board of Peace. That invitation was significant. It was a recognition of the Vatican's moral weight and its potential role in healing one of the most intractable conflicts in the world. But the Vatican said no. And in doing so, it sent a message. We will not lend our moral authority to an initiative that sidelines the United Nations and sets a precedent we believe is dangerous for the future of international cooperation. That's a principled position. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but you have to respect the consistency and the seriousness with which the Vatican approaches these questions. Let's take stock of who has joined the Board of Peace and who has declined, because the composition of this coalition tells you a lot about the geopolitical alignments of 2026. 17 countries signed the charter in Davos. That included leaders from Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Israel formally joined last week. Over $5 billion in aid has been pledged, but some notable countries have said no. Poland declined. Italy declined. The Vatican declined. France, Germany, and several other major European powers have been invited but haven't committed yet. Russia and China were also invited. It's hard to imagine either of them joining an initiative led by the United States that involves post-war governance in a region where both Moscow and Beijing have their own interests. But the invitation itself is interesting. It's a signal from Trump that he's willing to work with adversaries if they're willing to contribute constructively. Ukraine was invited as well, which raises its own set of questions. Ukraine is still at war with Russia. Inviting both Ukraine and Russia to the same peace board is either a stroke of diplomatic genius or a recipe for dysfunction, depending on how it plays out. The countries that have joined the board are a mix of U.S. allies, countries looking to boost their international profile, and nations with economic interests in post-war reconstruction contracts. That's not a criticism. It's just reality. International coalitions are always built on a combination of shared values, strategic interests, and pragmatic calculations. This is the kind of coalition building that we often see debated in Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings, the tension between working through established multilateral institutions versus building flexible partnerships that can actually get things done. So where does all of this go from here? The Board of Peace is holding its first formal meeting this Wednesday in Washington, D.C. That's when the $5 billion in pledged aid is supposed to be formally committed. That meeting will be a key test of whether this coalition can actually deliver or whether it's mostly theater. The real challenges begin after the pledges are made. Money is important, but it's not sufficient. Rebuilding Gaza requires security. It requires governance. It requires buy-in from the Palestinian people. It requires cooperation from Egypt, from Israel, from the Arab states, and from whoever ends up controlling Gaza politically after Hamas. None of those things are guaranteed. In fact, all of them are deeply contested and uncertain. The Vatican's decision to sit this out doesn't doom the Board of Peace, but it does deprive the initiative of a powerful moral voice that could have helped bridge divides and build trust. And it raises the question of whether other countries, particularly in Europe, will follow the Vatican's lead and either decline to join or participate only half-heartedly. Trump's vision is that the Board of Peace can succeed precisely because it's not constrained by the UN's bureaucracy and political gridlock. The Vatican's counterargument is that without the legitimacy and universal participation that the UN provides, the Board of Peace risks becoming just another geopolitical project that serves the interests of the powerful while leaving the vulnerable behind. Time will tell which vision is correct, but what's clear already is that this debate is far from settled, and the future of Gaza and the future of international crisis management more broadly hangs in the balance. The Vatican just said no to President Trump's Board of Peace, not because the Holy See doesn't care about Gaza, but because it believes the United Nations, not an American-led coalition, should be managing post-conflict recovery. That decision reflects a fundamental disagreement about how the international system should work. Trump and his supporters believe the UN is broken, slow, and ineffective, and that action-oriented coalitions are the way to get things done. The Vatican and its allies believe the UN, for all its flaws, is the only institution with the legitimacy and universality to manage global crises in a way that protects the weak and upholds international law. Who's right? That's a question that will define the next decade of international politics, and it's a debate that's happening right now in Senate hearing rooms, in State Department briefings, and in diplomatic cables around the world. We'll be watching every development, every pledge, every country that joins or declines, and we'll decode it all for you every time. If this video gave you value, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Vatican made the right call, or should they have joined? And subscribe to Senate Decoded if you haven't already, because this story is just getting started. This has been Senate Decoded. I'll see you in the next one.